People like you don't belong in a place like this. Those were the words. I remember them exactly, the way you remember the last thing someone says before a door closes forever. Then his hand came across my face. The sound of it filled the whole diner. A cup stopped halfway to a stranger's mouth. A waitress froze with a coffee pot in her hand. And the sting spread across my cheek like fire, hot and bright and humiliating in a way I had not felt since I was a boy. But that is not what broke me. What broke me was that, when I lifted my eyes past the young officer's shoulder, I saw another man in uniform standing 6 feet away, watching, not moving. A man with my jaw and my mother's eyes and my own stubborn silence written all over his face. My son. I had exactly 10 minutes before everything in that town changed. And he had 10 minutes to decide who he really was. To understand why a man who had commanded thousands of soldiers was standing in a roadside diner letting a stranger strike him without lifting a hand, and why the boy I raised could not make his feet move, I have to take you back. Not far. Just 3 days. To the morning I came home to a place I had spent 40 years trying to forget. My name is not important yet. In that town, for those first few days, I wanted to be nobody at all. That was the whole point. I grew up in Colburn, a small county town where the water tower still has the same faded paint and the same crack down the letter O. My mother, Ruth, cleaned other people's houses 6 days a week. She would leave before the sun came up and come home after dark with her hands smelling of bleach and lemon. And she never once let me see her cry, though I know now that she did. We had nothing. A rented house on Miller Road with a porch that sagged on one side and a kitchen table with one short leg my mother fixed with a folded piece of cardboard. But my mother had a saying. She would put her rough hand under my chin, lift my face up, and tell me, "A man can take your money, your job, even your name off a door. He cannot take your dignity unless you hand it to him. Never hand it to anybody, Elias." I left Colburn the week I turned 18. I joined the army because it was the only door that would open for a poor black kid from a town that had already decided what I was allowed to become. And I climbed. God, how I climbed. I studied when other men slept. I said yes to every hard posting, every forgotten outpost, every assignment no one wanted. 36 years later, I wore 3 stars on my shoulder, and men who would not have shaken my father's hand now stood when I walked into a room. But climbing costs something. It always does. And I paid for it with the 2 people I loved most. My wife, Naomi, died young. Too young. And after she was gone, grief did to me what enemies never could. I sent our son to my mother in Colburn, telling myself it was for his own good, that a boy needed roots and a school and a grandmother's cooking more than he needed a father who was never in the same country twice. I told myself I would come back. I told myself a lot of things. Years passed, and a silence grew between my son and me that neither of us knew how to cross. The last real conversation we had, he was a young man, and he stood in that same sagging house and looked at me with his mother's eyes and said, "You chose the uniform over us. Just say it." I did not say anything. That was my great weakness. When it mattered most, I have always been a man who says nothing. Silence had carried me up the ranks. Silence had gotten me through wars. And silence had cost me my only child. His name is David. And by the time this story begins, I had not spoken to him in almost 9 years. 3 months before that morning in the diner, my mother died. Ruth Monroe, 87 years old, still in that same house on Miller Road, still refusing to move even when her knees gave out. I paid for the funeral from a distance and did not attend, because David had made it clear through a lawyer that he did not want me there. So I mourned her alone in a hotel 4 states away, holding the little brass pin she used to wear on her church coat, the only thing of hers I owned. Then, 2 weeks before that morning, the phone rang. It was the office of the governor. There was going to be a ceremony. The state was naming the new Veterans Center in the county after me. The poor boy from Miller Road who had risen to general and had just been confirmed to a senior federal post in Washington. There would be a dedication, speeches, a federal delegation, a protective detail, because that was simply how things worked now for a man in my position. I almost said no. But then I thought of two things I still needed to do in Colburn before I died. I needed to stand at my mother's grave and tell her I was sorry. And I needed, somehow, to find the courage to look my son in the eye one more time. So I said yes. And I made one request that my staff thought was strange. I asked to arrive a full day early, quietly, without the motorcade, without the aides, without a single soul knowing the general was in town. I wanted one morning as nobody. One morning to be just Ruth Monroe's boy walking his old streets. I checked into a small hotel off the highway under a name that was not mine, wearing a plain dark coat and no insignia of any kind. I told my head of security, a sharp young agent named Portis, that I would be resting all morning and did not want to be disturbed. He did not like it. His job was to always know where I was. But he agreed to give me until noon. That was my second mistake. My first was thinking I could go home unseen. The next morning I walked. I walked past the church where my mother sang. I walked past the school that once turned me away. And I walked out to Route 9, to the empty lot where our house on Miller Road used to stand before the county tore it down. And across from it, where the old feed store used to be, there was now a diner. The Depot Diner. Red vinyl booths in the window. A hand-painted sign. A place my mother would have loved. I did not know it yet, but there was a box in my rental car that would change everything I believed about my son. My mother's lawyer had shipped me her few belongings, and I had thrown the box in the trunk without opening it. I could not bring myself to look inside. Not yet. I walked into that diner a little after 9 in the morning, tired, dusty from the road, an old black man in a plain coat, and I sat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs from a kind woman named Alma who had no idea who I was. For about 20 minutes, it was the best morning I had spent in years. Then the door opened, and 2 officers walked in. I did not look up right away, but I felt the temperature of the room change. The quiet laughter at the far booth stopped. Alma stood up a little straighter behind the counter. And when I finally glanced toward the door, my heart stopped in my chest, because one of those 2 officers was my son, David. Grown now, broad in the shoulders, a badge on his chest and a hard set to his jaw that I recognized because I had given it to him. He was standing just inside the door, and his eyes had already found me, and I watched the color drain out of his face as recognition rolled through him like a wave. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. 9 years of silence stood in the air between us, and neither one of us knew how to be the first to break it. But the other officer did not know any of that. The younger one, Cody Renner, though I would not learn his name until later. He was maybe 30, with a shaved head and a body built in a gym and the restless, hungry look of a man who has never once felt like enough. He walked past David toward the counter, and his eyes landed on me the way a certain kind of man's eyes always land on a certain kind of stranger. "Morning, Alma," he said, but he was looking at me. "You letting folks just wander in off the highway now?" Alma's voice was careful. "He's a paying customer, Cody. Having his breakfast." Renner leaned on the counter beside me. Close. Too close. I could smell his aftershave and his coffee breath and his need to be seen doing something. "You got some ID on you, Chief?" he asked me. "I do," I said quietly. "Is there a problem, officer?" "There's been some break-ins along Route 9. Folks casing the empty lots. And here you are. New face. Sitting where you got a clean view of the road." He smiled without any warmth in it at all. "So yeah, there's a problem. Let me see it. Now, I want to be honest with you about something, because this story is not about a monster in a uniform. Cody Renner grew up poorer than I did. I learned that later too. He had a father who drank and a department that taught him that respect was something you took from people, never something you earned. He had been written up twice that year for being too aggressive, and he was terrified of losing the one thing that made him feel like somebody. So when a quiet old man refused to flinch in front of him, it did not read as innocence. It read as a challenge. I reached slowly for my wallet, the way you learn to move when you have watched what happens to men who move too fast. And I made a decision in that moment that I have thought about every day since. I decided not to tell him who I was. I could have. 3 words would have ended it. But my mother's voice was in my head. A man cannot take your dignity unless you hand it to him. And some stubborn, wounded part of me wanted to see what this town would do to Ruth Monroe's boy when it did not know he had become anybody at all. I wanted to know the truth about the place that raised me. So I handed him a plain ID that had my name on it, Elias Monroe, and nothing else. No rank, no title. Renner looked at it and snorted. Monroe. You know, we had a whole family of Monroes out on Miller Road. Trash, mostly. He said it right to my face. He had no idea he was talking about my mother. And across the room, I saw my son flinch. That's enough, Cody. David's voice, finally. Low. Strained. Relax, Renner said, not even turning around. I'm just talking to the man. He slid my ID back across the counter, but he did not step away. Tell you what, old-timer, I think you've had enough coffee. I think it's time for you to move along before you make these good people nervous. I'll finish my breakfast, I said, calm, even, and then I'll go. I've paid. I should not have said it. I know that. It was pride. It was the same pride that had cost me my son. But I was so tired of being made small in the one place on earth that was supposed to be mine. Renner's face changed. Something in him that had been looking for a reason found one. You deaf. He grabbed my arm. I said move. Take your hand off me, son. Don't you call me son. And then it happened. He pulled me half off the stool, and when I planted my feet and did not go easily, when I did the one unforgivable thing of simply standing my ground, he drew back his open hand and he slapped me across the face in front of the whole diner. People like you don't belong in a place like this. The room went dead silent. My cheek was on fire, and I lifted my eyes past Renner's shoulder to where my son stood, frozen, one hand halfway to his own weapon. His face a war between 9 years of anger and one clear moment of horror. And David did nothing. He did not step forward. He did not say stop. He stood there, and in his eyes I saw the boy in that sagging house saying you chose the uniform over us, and I understood that some ugly, buried part of him was, for one terrible second, glad to see the great General Monroe made small. To see me finally know what it felt like to stand somewhere and have no one come for you. That silence between us, the silence I had built, the silence I had taught him, it chose that moment to become a weapon. And it was pointed at me. Get up, Renner said. He hauled me toward the door. Out, before I run you in for resisting. He shoved me through the door and out onto the gravel, and I stumbled and caught myself against the hood of a parked truck. My hat fell in the dirt. My hands were shaking, not from fear but from something older and deeper. And behind me, through the glass, I could see my son still standing exactly where he had been. Not moving, watching his father get thrown into the street like garbage. Renner stood in the doorway, breathing hard, proud of himself. Don't let me see you around here again, he said. And then he made the mistake that ended his career. He turned his back on me, walked inside, and let the door swing shut, absolutely certain that he had just won. He had no idea that at that exact moment, for miles away, my head of security had knocked on a hotel door that did not answer. He had no idea that a man named Portis had opened that door, found the room empty, and felt the floor drop out of his stomach. He had no idea that a locator was already pinging a phone in my coat pocket, and that a coded message was already going out across 3 agencies at once. Principal is off-site. Location unknown. Move. He had no idea that 10 minutes was all he had left of the life he knew. I want to tell you what those 10 minutes were like, standing alone in that gravel lot, because they were the longest of my life, and not for the reason you would think. Picked up my hat. I brushed the dust off it slowly. My cheek throbbed. Cars went by on Route 9, and not one of them slowed down. And I stood there, 61 years old, a general, a man who had shaken hands with presidents, and I felt exactly like the 8-year-old boy who had once been told to use the back door of a house my mother cleaned. I could have called Portis right then and ended it. My phone was in my pocket. One word and this whole town would tilt on its axis. But I did not reach for it, because a strange, still clarity had come over me, the kind that comes to you sometimes when everything is stripped away. And in that clarity I realized the slap was not the wound. The slap I could forgive. Renner was a frightened, small man who had been handed a badge by people who should have known better. He was almost to be pitied. The wound was on the other side of that glass door, wearing my son's face. So I stood there, and I made no call, and I let the 10 minutes run, because in some quiet corner of my heart I was waiting. I was waiting to see if the boy I had raised, the boy I had failed, still had it in him to walk out that door on his own. Not because a general needed rescuing. Because a son needed to become a certain kind of man, and no motorcade in the world could do that for him. The door opened. David came out, slowly, his hat in his hands. He stopped a few feet from me, and up close I could see he had gotten older too, that there were lines by his eyes now, that life had worn on him the way it wears on all of us. He could not look at me. I didn't know it was going to go like that, he said. His voice was barely a whisper. You knew it was me, I said. Yeah. A long silence. I knew. And you stood there. He flinched like I had struck him. You want to talk about standing there and doing nothing? You. His voice cracked. 9 years came pouring out. You stood on the other side of the world doing nothing while I grew up in that house waiting for a father who never came. Don't you dare stand in this parking lot and act wounded. You taught me how to leave a person standing alone. I learned it from a master. And there it was. The truth of us, laid out in the gravel between a diner and a road. He was not wrong. That is what made it unbearable. He was not wrong. I opened my mouth. And for once in my miserable, decorated life, I did not stay silent. David, I said, I wrote you. Every month. For years. I sent money. I sent letters. I begged you to let me come. You're lying. But something moved behind his eyes. Your grandmother has a box, I said. In the house. Or she did. A shoebox, blue with a rubber band around it. Have you cleared out the house yet? Have you looked? His face went white. Because he had. He had cleared out that house 3 months ago, after we buried her. And he had found a blue shoebox with a rubber band around it, full of letters he had never seen in my handwriting, some of them still sealed, and money orders going back 15 years, made out to him, never cashed. He had found them the week before, and he had not been able to make sense of them. And that, I understood now, was why he had frozen in that diner. He was not just looking at the father who abandoned him. He was looking at a man whose whole story had just cracked open in his hands, and he did not know anymore which one of us was the villain. She told me you didn't want us, I said quietly. My mother, your grandmother. She loved you more than her own life, David. But she was a hard woman who never forgave me for taking her son away to the army and getting him killed in her mind. When Naomi died and I fell apart and sent you to her, she decided she would keep you and keep me out. She sent my letters back. She told you I chose the uniform. And I let her, because I believed a boy was better off with roots than with a broken father. And because I was a coward who found it easier to be silent than to fight. My own voice broke now. That was my sin. Not that I didn't love you. That I didn't fight for you. Those are different things, and I have spent 9 years learning the difference too late. David sat down. Right there on the curb of the parking lot, this grown man with a badge, and he put his face in his hands. And I sat down next to him, an old man in a dusty coat. And for the first time in 9 years my son and I were in the same place at the same time, saying true things. I found the box, he whispered. I've read them all. I didn't know what to think. I've been walking around for a week like I don't know my own name. He looked up at me, and his eyes were wet. And then you walk into my diner out of nowhere, and I froze. Dad. I'm sorry. I froze. That was when I heard it. Engines. A lot of them. Coming fast down Route 9. I looked up, and coming over the rise, one after another, black and gleaming in the morning sun, were the SUVs. Not one. Not two. I counted them without meaning to. 10 black SUVs moving in a tight formation the way only a professional detail moves, kicking up a wall of dust, and they came off the highway and into that gravel lot and surrounded it in a maneuver that took maybe 4 seconds, and doors were opening before the wheels had fully stopped. Men and women in dark suits and vests, state troopers, federal agents, and out of the lead vehicle, moving fast, came Portis. His face a mask of controlled panic that dissolved into relief the instant he saw me sitting on the curb. General Monroe. He was at my side, kneeling, scanning me for injuries, his eyes going to the red mark on my cheek and hardening into something dangerous. Sir, are you hurt? What happened? Who did this? The whole lot had gone still. Through the diner window I could see the faces. Alma, her hand over her mouth. The customers half standing. And Cody Renner, who had come to the door to see what the noise was, and who was now staring at 10 federal vehicles and a swarm of agents surrounding the old man he had slapped. And I watched the exact moment the truth arrived on his face. I watched it drain the blood out of him and turn his knees to water. He grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling. Portis helped me to my feet. Agents were moving. Someone had already crossed to Renner and was quietly, firmly separating him from his weapon while a trooper spoke into a radio. It was all happening with a terrible, smooth efficiency, and I realized with a cold weight in my stomach that if I said one wrong word in that moment, if I let my anger off its chain even for a second, I could erase Cody Renner from the face of the earth. His job, his pension, his freedom, his name, all of it. It would take me a sentence. Everyone in that lot was waiting for the sentence. And I thought of my mother, lifting my chin with her rough hand. A man can take your money, your job, even your name off a door. I looked at Renner, that frightened, shaking man clinging to a doorframe, a man who was every ugly thing this town had ever tried to make me feel about myself, and I understood that I was holding the same open hand he had raised against my face. The only difference between us in that instant was what I chose to do with it. Portis, I said. My voice carried across the whole silent lot. Nobody touches him. Portis turned. Sir. He assaulted I know what he did. I walked toward Renner. Slowly. The agents parted for me, and I stood in front of the young officer who had slapped me, close, the way he had stood close to me at the counter, and I watched him brace for the worst thing I could do to him. Do you know who I am now? I asked him quietly. Yes, sir. He could barely get the word out. General. Sir, I didn't. 20 minutes ago I was nobody to you. An old man in a coat. And you decided that gave you the right to put your hands on me. I let that sit. The badge on your chest is not a weapon, son. It is a promise. You made a promise to every person in this town, including the ones who walk in dusty and tired and refuse to look small, and this morning you broke it. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Tears were running down his face now. I understand. Please. My family. I've got. I know you do. And I did. And that is what saved him in the end. Because I looked at Cody Renner and I did not see a monster. I saw a poor, frightened kid who had been failed by every man who was ever supposed to teach him what strength really was. I saw a version of what I might have become if my mother had been a different woman, if I had never had a hand under my chin lifting my face up. Here is what is going to happen, I said, and I said it loud enough for the troopers, for Alma, for the whole watching lot to hear, because this next part was not just for him. There will be an investigation, a real one, not the kind this department is used to burying. I want everything looked at, not just today. Everything, every complaint that got filed and forgotten. Every man who got thrown out a door for the crime of standing where somebody didn't want him standing. This does not stop with you, officer. You are the smallest part of it. I turned to the trooper with the radio. I want the sergeant who signed off on this man's last 2 write-ups. I want to know who taught him that this was policing, because a rot like this does not grow on one branch. Then I turned back to Renner, and I lowered my voice so it was just for him. I am not going to end you today, I said. Not because you deserve mercy, because ending you is easy, and you would spend the rest of your life telling yourself you were the victim of some powerful man's revenge, and you would never once have to look at what you actually are. So instead you are going to lose that badge the right way, through a review on the record with your name attached to your own choices. And then you are going to have to live as a man who has to earn his way back to being somebody, without a gun on your hip to do it for you. I paused. That is not mercy, son. That is the harder road. I am giving it to you because I believe you might one day be worth it. Don't make me wrong. He was crying too hard to answer. He just nodded. The consequences came in time exactly the way I said they would. Cody Renner was placed on leave that afternoon and, after a review that could no longer be buried because a federal delegation and the governor's office were suddenly very interested in a small town department, he lost his badge. Sergeant Boyd, the man who had trained him and shielded him and taught a generation of young officers that respect was something you took, was forced into retirement, and 2 other cases that had been quietly closed were reopened. The department got a new chief and a monitor and a long overdue reckoning with itself. The town of Colburn, the town that had decided what I was allowed to become, was made to look, finally, at what it had allowed to grow in its own house. But none of that is the Part 1 carry with me. The Part 1 carry is what happened after the SUVs, when the agents had pulled back and the sun was high, and my son David was still standing in that parking lot, watching his father, seeing me maybe for the first time in his whole life as the man I actually was and the man I had failed to be, both at once. There's something I still have to do, I told him. Will you come with me? We drove out to the cemetery on the hill. The 2 of us in my rental car with that blue shoe box on the back seat, and neither of us said much because some silences are not walls. Some silences are just 2 men getting ready. We stood at my mother's grave together. Ruth Monroe, the woman who cleaned other people's houses and raised her son and then raised her grandson and, God help her, loved us both so fiercely and so wrongly that she nearly destroyed us, keeping us apart. I put her little brass pin on the top of the headstone. I'm sorry, Mama, I said out loud, for all of it, for leaving, for letting you carry what I should have carried. And I forgive you, too. I know why you did it. You were scared of losing him the way you lost me. I understand being scared of losing your boy. I looked at David. I understand it now more than ever. And David, my son, who had frozen in a diner while a stranger struck his father, reached over and took my hand. A grown man, a police officer, taking his old father's hand at his grandmother's grave. I don't know how to fix 9 years, he said. You don't fix it, I told him. Your grandmother tried to fix things by controlling them, and it broke everything she touched. That was her lesson to us, and we almost didn't learn it in time. I squeezed his hand. You don't fix 9 years, David. You just decide, starting right now, that you're not going to be silent anymore. That's all any of us can do. Refuse to hand over your dignity. And refuse to stand quiet when they take somebody else's. He nodded. And then this hard, grown man put his head on my shoulder and cried like the boy I had left behind. And I held him, and I let myself cry too, and 40 years of silence finally broke. We are not fully healed, my son and I. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think the honest ending is the only one worth telling. 9 years do not vanish because 2 men weep at a grave. But we talk now, every week. He calls me. Sometimes we have nothing to say and we sit on the phone in a comfortable quiet that is a completely different thing from the silence that nearly ruined us. He left that department. He is a better man than the badge he served under ever let him be. And Cody Renner. About a year later I got a letter. Handwritten. He had gotten work at a shelter for veterans, of all places, driving a van, showing up early, doing the small unglamorous things that no one claps for. He wrote that he thought about that morning every single day. He wrote that he was trying to become a man who would have walked into that diner and stopped it, instead of the man who started it. He did not ask me for anything. He just wanted me to know. I keep that letter next to my mother's pin. So here is what I have learned, and I offer it to you for whatever it is worth. Power is not the black SUVs. Power is not the 3 stars or the title or the swarm of agents who will come running when your name is spoken. All of that arrived 10 minutes too late to save my dignity, and it could not have saved it anyway because dignity was never something those SUVs were carrying. I carried it in myself the whole time, the same way I carried it when I was a poor boy with a mother who cleaned houses, because a man's worth was never in the eyes of the officer who slapped him. It was in whether he handed his dignity over or held on to it, and in what he chose to do with his own open hand when the moment finally turned and the power was all his. The greatest thing you will ever have is not the ability to destroy the person who wronged you. It is the ability to choose not to, and to demand something better of them and of yourself instead. Anyone can strike back. It takes a whole life of learning to lift a person's chin the way my mother lifted mine, and say, "You are worth more than the worst thing you did. Now go and prove it." That is the true power, and no one can slap it out of you. So let me leave you with one question, and I truly hope you will sit with it and tell me your answer below. If you had been standing in that parking lot, holding all that power in your hands, with the man who humiliated you shaking in front of you, and the whole town waiting to see what you would you have had the strength to choose the harder road and offer him a chance to become better? Or would you have said the one sentence that ends a man forever? Be honest. I am still not sure I got it right. I only know I got to keep my son.